Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the differences between what's known as the soft landing and the hard landing. As the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to cool inflation and slow down the economy, eventually we expect the economy, in fact, to cool. And to determine whether the Fed's done a good job at raising rates appropriately or maybe moving too aggressively or too late, we measure the degree of the recovery. On the left-hand side, we see a very well-known period of time between 1989 and 94, where the Federal Reserve ended up reducing interest rates from 9.85% down to 2.66%. This was known as a soft landing. The economy slowed down to an appropriate level. It did not lead to a recession, and it led to a tremendous economic boom in the late 1990s. Notice on the left-hand side of the chart in particular, we see the 9.85% interest rate go down to 2.66%. And during the same period of time, the S&P 500, the white line, enjoyed a steady trend to the upside with a relatively low amount of volatility. Conversely, between the years 2006 through 2009, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates from 5.34% down to 0.25%. But it's often thought that they lowered rates too late and perhaps they raised rates too aggressively, and that led to the ensuing recession. Now we see here present day the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates to cool the economy up to a 5.5% level. The rate of increase certainly is unprecedented. It's difficult to determine yet if they've raised rates too aggressively or maybe not enough. However, it certainly goes without saying that they've raised rates tremendously quickly. Now we're going to look at five different very common indicators, including we see here the GDP, the gross domestic product, to measure the soft and hard landings and try to create a template moving forward so we can measure whether the Federal Reserve is doing a good job in present day. So, first off, we take the period of 1989 to 94. We had a 4.4% GDP level at that point, and that dropped down to a 3.6% in the negative, a negative 3.6%. That is how much the economy declined during the slowdown, during the rise in interest rates. Now, that was considered to be a soft landing, a moderate recession. A recession is defined by two consecutive quarters of negative GDP. Conversely, in 2006, we saw a 5.5% GDP translate to negative 8.5%, a much deeper recession, so to speak. We saw four consecutive quarters and 6 out of 5 consecutive quarters of negative GDP numbers, certainly a much deeper recession. Now, present day, we have GDP at 4.9%. Certainly was a surprise to many, and it's a shock based on the last 4 quarters, which were in the low to mid 2% level. Certainly no fear of a recession based on the GDP at present date. Now we take a look at the unemployment rate. In the early 1990s, late 1980s, we had a 5% unemployment rate, which during the slowdown rose to a 7.8% level. Conversely, in 2007, we had a 4.4% unemployment rate that went up to as high as 10%, almost 600 basis points to the upside. Certainly a spike in unemployment. Currently, we have a very low 3.7%, and it's been low for quite a long time, actually. We have the Consumer Price Index, the most commonly used indicator to measure the rate of inflation. In the early 1990s, we had a 6.4% rate of inflation that slowed down to 2.7%. Conversely, in 2008, we had a 5.5% inflation level that went down to a negative 2.0%. Keep in mind, by the way, the Federal Reserve has a 2% inflation target. So the fact of the matter is, when inflation went to a negative 2%, it means the Federal Reserve overshot their target. Well, we still have a 2% inflation target. Right now, we have an 8.9% level on CPI that has dropped down to 3.3. So we're heading in the right direction, but we're still not at the target quite yet. We have core CPI, at 5.7% in the early 1990s, going down to 2.7%. The difference is core CPI excludes food and energy, which are considered to be more volatile components of the inflationary index. Now, compare and contrast that to where we are now. 2020 to 2023, 6.6% down to 3.9%. We certainly see a cooling in the inflation rate, but still quite high. Housing starts, considered to be by many a leading indicator. We had a negative 3% housing starts in the late 1980s that went down to a negative 49%. Housing starts, by the way, are basically indications of new future projects. So it's considered to be a leading indicator within the home builder index. Conversely, in 2006, we had housing starts at 6%. They dropped down to negative 55%, a huge decline. Certainly, the 2008 recession is defined by large part due to the slowdown in the housing market. We have housing starts present date at 7.6%. It's a second consecutive month of positive numbers. For the better part of 2022 and 2023, we've seen negative numbers. We want to see this trend improve. It's barely positive and only very recently. Now we have University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, we had a 97.9%, 97.9 reading, so to speak, which actually dropped down to 63.9. By the way, the 100 level was established as basically the baseline, and numbers below 100 indicate any kind of slowdown. The consumer sentiment measures the level of confidence on the street in finance, personal finances, business conditions, etc. 63.9 was that low of 2000, I'm sorry, of 1991. Now, fast forward 2006, we went from 91.7 to 55.3, saw a lower low. So we were in the 60s in 1991, we were in the 50s in 2008. Right now we're at 61.3. It's actually kind of low. Comparing to the other numbers, this is probably more on the negative side. Certainly housing starts is not great either. The unemployment rate looks good. GDP looks very good. The University of Michigan consumer sentiment is just barely above where it was basically in the 1991 slowdown. So going back, we can really use both of these examples, a soft landing on the left-hand side, a hard landing on the right-hand side, to serve as a template for what the Federal Reserve should and should not do. Again, notice the white lines in each chart, the S&P 500. A proper slowdown slows down economic growth only enough to allow for innovation to catch up with the prices. But a hard landing, when the Federal Reserve waits too long or perhaps raises rates too aggressively, that results in a very large deflationary period where stocks and housing prices really kind of crash. So that's what we want to try to avoid. And we can use these two periods of time as a template to compare moving forward. Again, GDP looks very good right now. Unemployment rate looks very good. Consumer sentiment, housing starts, not so much. So we're going to continue to watch these and many other numbers along the way and compare them to what we've seen in history. If you'd like a full report of what we've spoken about today, it's published in our Substack newsletter. We'll place a link in the comments of this video as well to bring you directly there. We encourage you to read it. This serves as a summary, but we really go into a lot more detail within the newsletter. We hope this has been helpful. We look forward to seeing you back soon.